Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this third episode in our series on grasslands. I'm Jen Cavexis. I'm Program Director at the Salazar Center for North American Conservation at Colorado State University. This series is a joint effort. To present this series, we've partnered with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and the Center for Collaborative Conservation, also at CSU. Just so everyone's aware, this is the third episode in our series. We do have one more webinar next week, so I invite you to stay tuned for next week to close out the series with us. This webinar series was inspired by a large undertaking to conserve grasslands called the Central Grasslands Roadmap, which is a North American effort of combined hundreds of individuals and organizations working together toward resilient and sustainable grasslands in the diverse communities they support. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that people have lived on North American grasslands for thousands of years, and Indigenous peoples are still very much present on grasslands today. We've tried to weave some of those themes throughout this Grasslands webinar series, but where I'm sitting today is the traditional homeland of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Just a few quick logistics, as you already heard. We're going to invite you to put your questions into the chat. We are really interested in hearing more about what you're curious to know more about grasslands from today's episode. Sadly, we probably won't be able to get through everyone's questions, but we'll do our best to weave some of those questions into our dialogue today. If you caught our first two episodes in this series, you know that in our first two episodes, we really explored the big picture science, ecology of grasslands, and the various ways that people are dependent on and help manage grasslands. Today, we're going to dive into a specific conservation success story that was decades in the making, and it's based right here in northern Colorado. I'm so excited today. We have two outstanding guests with us. First, we'll hear from Meegan Flenniken as Land Conservation Planning and Resource Division Manager for Larimer County Department of Natural Resources. Meegan oversees the department's land acquisitions, planning, capital construction, natural and cultural resource management, education and volunteers, and if that wasn't enough, she also manages the trails programs. She received her MS in natural resources from Colorado State University and a BA in biology from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Prior to her graduate studies, she worked for the City of Colorado Springs and Boulder open space programs. Welcome, Meegan.
Thanks, Jen. Looking forward to sharing with you all today.
Excellent. Our second speaker today is Arvind Panjabi. Arvind is a senior research scientist at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in Fort Collins, where he works to conserve birds of Western North America through an integrated approach of science, education, and land stewardship. He has spent much of his 22 years at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies developing partnerships in local capacity to advance bird conservation in Latin America, especially in northern Mexico, where he currently coordinates a network of ranchers to voluntarily conserve and enhance habitat for grassland birds. Arvind has published over 20 peer-reviewed scientific articles on the ecology and conservation of North American birds, including a landmark paper on the loss of 3 billion birds from North America since 1970. He works closely with Partners in Flight and other national and international groups to coordinate bird conservation priorities among agencies and conservation organizations. Welcome, Arvind.
Hi, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, Meegan, if you want to get started with your presentation.
Okay, great. All right, Jen, I trust you can see that okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to join the webinar. And as Jen mentioned, I'm Meegan Flenniken. I work for Larimer County, it's Department of Natural Resources. Larimer County is the north end of the Front Range. And our department, the Larimer County Department of Natural Resources, is one that has been around since the 50s with the construction of the large reservoirs up here in Larimer County as part of the Colorado Big Thompson project. So Horsetooth Reservoir, Carter Lake, if you've been up to enjoy those spaces. And in the 1990s, we, as a community, passed a sales tax, like many other Front Range counties and West Slope counties in Colorado, to help acquire additional lands and conserve additional lands for the purposes of protecting wildlife habitat, creating buffers between communities, buffers to other public lands that already existed in the county, to provide close-in recreation opportunities to our growing communities at that time, and then to protect other values, scenic values, separators between the different cities. And we, since that time, have been fortunate enough to have conserved over 55,000 acres of land within Larimer County with partners. Some of that land we've acquired in fee simple, so it's owned by the county, and we manage it in many cases for natural resources values, ecological outcomes, but also providing some amount of appropriate public access. And then the other 50% of those lands we've acquired, we have done so via a tool called a conservation easement. And that's one where the land is still in private ownership with private landowners. That landowner can continue to, in many cases, graze their property, enjoy it as they have, but it generally restricts in perpetuity certain development rights. And so by doing that, we don't, it doesn't have public access, but it achieves protection of many of the values I described that we look to conserve. We have a master plan that guides our work, and this is available on our website if anyone's interested. I saw there's some folks from Fort Collins joining us that might want to delve into it a little bit more. But our master plan has 12 priority areas. This is a map of Larimer County. You can see Wyoming at the north end, and then I-25 over here on the east boundary. And these 12 priority areas really guide where we do land conservation work. You can see in green on the map are already conserved, primarily Larimer County owned properties. The orange are conservation easements. And the priority areas are highlighted as sort of the shaded bubbles. So a lot of that area, you can imagine, provides conservation of many of the values I described. So for example, if you look at this region just west of Fort Collins, we have a lot of public open space in that area now, a lot of trail systems close into the communities. It conserves the hogback and the scenic vista to the west of Fort Collins and Loveland. And then we've also conserved quite a few conservation easements through there to buffer those lands and protect some additional conservation values. So for today, we're really going to focus on this northern part of the county, where we've done quite a bit of conservation work to date. And we call it the Laramie Foothills Mountains to Plains Project. So here's a close-up of that area. And there's an imaginary line that didn't show up on my map that, again, is the Wyoming-Colorado state line. And over on the east side is I-25. In this area, the Laramie Foothills Mountains to Plains area was identified in Larimer County and the city of Fort Collins and the Nature Conservancy's planning efforts over the last 30 or so years. And it really stood out as an area where we could achieve incredible conservation outcomes because this part of Larimer County is really at low jeopardy of development, had very little development as late as the early 1990s. And there was also quite a bit of conserved land on the western portion. So you can see this checkerboard of Roosevelt National Forest in the dark green, some tan state of Colorado state wildlife areas. And this red circle basically shows where we look to really target trying to create a connection from the mountains to from the western side, where already federal and state lands had existed, through several ecotones from the montane as you head east to the grasslands and the edge of Larimer and Weld County's boundary. To date, since we worked with a lot of private landowners and were able to conserve lands in this area, through fee simple acquisitions like Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone Prairie Natural Area that have public access, as well as through conservation easements. Everything again in the orange are numerous conservation easements. We've conserved over 60,000 acres of land since around the year 2000. And so just include a few photos to give you a sense of this landscape, because it's hard to imagine unless you've seen it or you have some idea from these photos, really the scale of land conservation we've been able to accomplish in this region. So this is a photo standing on the Wyoming-Colorado state line looking south, primarily a Red Mountain open space. And you can see the interesting diversity of mountain mahogany shrublands, which is a very rare plant community in Larimer County, which is the shrub in the foreground of this picture, interspersed with grasslands. There's numerous perennial and ephemeral creeks that traverse the landscape. This is specifically soapstone prairie, which is predominantly shortgrass prairie, but also includes shrubland and riparian communities. And then the last thing I'll just touch on is for us, one of the amazing things about having been able to conserve land at this scale, especially as connected as it is between public and private land. Those fee simple and conservation easement acquisitions, it's allowed us to look at managing this landscape in a different way than we would, say, a couple thousand acre open space that might be more landlocked or surrounded by development or closer into communities. And one of the key things it's allowed us to do is look at how we can reintroduce species that would have been native or historically found on this landscape. And over time, we've been able to reintroduce native fish, worked on ferret reintroductions, and reintroduced or manage a herd called the Laramie Foothills bison conservation herd across Soapstone and Red Mountain. So with that, I'll stop talking and turn it over to Arvin to talk a little bit about some of the monitoring that we also do at Soapstone and Red Mountain, specific to grassland birds.
Thanks, Megan. It was a great introduction. And we'll jump right into the bird section of this hour. So whereas mammals like bison and pronghorn and prairie dogs and ferrets tend to be more familiar to many people in the public, grassland birds are actually the most diverse group of vertebrates that live in grasslands. They still are a pretty small group of birds when we think about all the birds in North America, of which we have roughly 700 species. Grassland birds, depending on how they're defined, represent a group of somewhere between 30 to 50 species of birds in North America, with varying degrees of dependence on grasslands. And we're going to be talking today specifically about grassland birds that breed in the Great Plains. And many of these species are found nowhere else on Earth and found only in native grassland habitats, like this chestnut-collared longspur you're seeing on the right of the screen here. But in general, although they're a small group of birds, grassland birds really are quite a diverse group taxonomically, ranging from owls and raptors to shorebirds to songbirds, and in particularly sparrows, North American sparrows, which are native to the continent, not the house sparrows that we have in our towns and cities. But that group of birds in particular is a very diverse group of birds for our grasslands. So I'm going to give a little overview about these birds and talk just briefly about the role that the Laramie Foothills Mountains to Plains project has played in the conservation of these species. Now, I'm going to start off here with a slide. So turn up your volume. I want you to imagine yourself standing in the dark in a wide open prairie just before the dawn. And soon you should be able to hear the sound of the dawn chorus beginning to surround you, growing in volume and variety. And again, please turn up your volumes on your computers if you don't hear the bird songs. Now in the prairie, the barrage of birdsong emanates from the ground and sky in 3 dimensions, bringing a surreal feel to what is otherwise a uniquely 2-dimensional landscape. And in the early morning, you can't see the birds, but they let you know they're there. You might hear the clear, cascading whistles of a western meadowlark, the melodic rhythms of a lark bunting, our state bird in Colorado, or the high, thin trill of a grasshopper sparrow. There are other birds in the grasslands as well, wetland birds such as killdeer, marbled godwits, pied-billed grebes. Together, all these birds create a symphony of sound that is unique to our prairie landscapes. Now, sadly, this opportunity to hear these birds is disappearing and becoming harder and harder to find as grasslands across the Americas continue to be lost to farmlands, to exurban development, to meet the demands of our growing population. So as a result, grassland bird populations are one of the most endangered groups of birds on the continent. All right, so birds of the central grasslands. This is a fairly discrete ecosystem, as you can see, contained entirely within the Great Plains of North America and the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico. And the birds that live here remain pretty much in this area year-round, moving between the Great Plains grasslands and the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands. That's over 90% of the migratory species that nest in the grasslands. There is a small group of birds that migrates onward to South America, to the Pampas grasslands in the southern cone of Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina. But like I said, 90% of these migratory species stay within the central grasslands region and roughly split their time between the northern Great Plains and the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands. They're dependent on both ecosystems. And this graphic on the left here just shows an overlay of the breeding range maps of those species of birds. And you can see there's a high concentration of species in the northern Great Plains and likewise in the Chihuahuan Desert in winter. So you may have heard from some, if you participated in some of the other series of speakers earlier in the month, that grasslands are a product of the physical and biological environment, both where they're located on the continent, in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, and the grazers that live within them shape the grasslands to be what they are and help maintain them. And the grazers in particular, the bison that Meegan mentioned, also prairie dogs, and today cattle, are grassland ecosystem engineers. And these birds, or these mammals, are really important for the birds because they literally create the spaces between the grass that the birds need to be able to move through what can otherwise be a thick, tall grassland. So I'm going to refer to this graphic created by Fritz Knopf over 20 years ago, but still does an excellent job of conveying the importance of grazing to create the habitat niches that grassland birds need on the landscape. You may look at a grassland and think it all looks the same, but there are actually unique niches and unique conditions within the grasslands that are critical to supporting certain species of birds. So as you can see in this graph, there's a group of birds on the left that are closely linked with high grazing pressure. These are birds like the mountain plover, the McCown's longspur, now been renamed the thick-billed longspur, the ferruginous hawk. And then there's a group of birds that have a little broader niche and can occupy both the very short grass and moderate to tall grasslands. And then another group of birds that requires taller grass and even shrubs in those grasslands for their habitat requirements. And again, the grazers are essential to creating all these niches for the birds. So without grazers, and today that is cattle, we would not have the diversity of grassland birds that we still do. But the grasslands of the central North America have suffered a lot over the years. They've been reduced through development of croplands, which now occupy the majority of what were formerly grasslands. They've been fragmented by roads infrastructure for power lines, energy development, and degraded in other ways through long-term overgrazing, loss of vegetation cover, and those grazing pressures also create a phenomenon known as shrub encroachment in the grasslands, where shrubs begin to thrive under heavy grazing pressure because they're not eaten, and eventually take over the grassland and transform it from a grassland to a shrubland, at which point it no longer can host that unique assemblage of birds. Invasive species, invasive grasses in particular, are also another big concern for birds and other species in the native grasslands. So Jen mentioned at the beginning that we recently published an article about the loss of birds in North America, and shockingly we found that since 1970 we have lost 3 billion birds from North America. That's roughly 29% of all the birds that we had on the continent back in 1970. And it may come as no surprise that grassland birds are the group of birds that have suffered the most. In fact, out of those 3 billion birds lost, 1 out of every 4 of those was a grassland bird. So in total, we've lost 53% of all the grassland birds on the continent. That equates to 720 million birds, roughly. And fully 75% of grassland bird species show statistically significant negative trends. All this determined through long-term continent-wide bird monitoring programs that have been ongoing since the late 1960s. But the situation for our birds of the central grasslands is in fact even worse than what this story shows. Birds that breed in the central grasslands and winter in the Chihuahuan Desert, which are again 90% of the migratory species, that grassland species, those birds have actually lost around 70% of their total population since 1970, and they're declining at a rate roughly twice as fast as other grassland birds on the continent that are found in the east or further west. So the Soapstone Prairie and Mountains to Plains Conservation Project, these have had a tremendous impact. I don't know, I think folks knew at the beginning that this was an important area for grassland birds, but after the city and county acquired Soapstone back around 2005, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies began doing inventories of the grassland birds on the property to find out what was there and what their populations were like. And we found that this area was home to 20 species of grassland birds that are of national, regional, or state level conservation concern. So it's a critically important site from a continental perspective, even small as it is. This map on the upper right reflects the shortgrass prairie region. So you can see the small dot there in northern Colorado that represents the Mountains to Plains project. So even though it's a drop in the bucket, so to speak, it is critically important to all these species of birds that we are losing throughout much of that region. And another interesting thing about this project that I'll mention, and then we'll get into some discussion, is that the protection of the lands in the Mountains to Plains area, we were able to leverage the investment made in a lot of the acquisitions, not the Soapstone property itself, but some of the properties around there, and leverage those to obtain federal grants through the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act to expand the impact of that investment to focus on grassland bird conservation needs in northern Mexico, which has been the focus of my work for the last almost 20 years. This investment has done more than protect just an important area in Colorado. It's helped protect lands in Mexico and helped fill research gaps and information gaps about those birds on their wintering grounds. Now, I'll leave you just with one last thought. Meegan did mention that we have been doing extensive monitoring on the Soapstone and some of the other properties in the Mountains to Plains area. And this graph is just to show that there are challenges. Despite protecting the land, it doesn't mean necessarily that the species found there will persist. oftentimes we need to take other actions to help manage those species, because the world we live in today is so much different than what it has been historically. And of course, when we're talking about migratory birds, these birds also depend on areas outside of soapstone and outside of Colorado. So we need to be thinking about their full life cycle, and clearly factors elsewhere in the life cycle can influence the trends that we see here in Colorado and here in the mountains to plains area. So whereas birds like burrowing owl have been able to persist through some turbulent years, they are now doing quite well in the area. These data only go through 2017, but unfortunately, a couple of other species that depend on similar habitats. These are the shortgrass obligate birds that are found primarily in prairie dog colonies, and thus are subject to changes in prairie dog population and density. A couple of these, like the mountain plover and the thick-billed longspur, are in decline, even in the mountains to plains area. So we need to find solutions on how to prevent further declines and recover their populations. And with that, I think I'll turn it over and open it up for discussion.
Thank you both so much for that. That was amazing. Arvin, I think I want to start sort of where you left off a little bit. You both touched on the notion of the connectivity across this landscape and the importance of having diverse ecotypes of different sorts. I'm wondering if maybe we could just start there and elaborate a bit more on what you've learned from working in this landscape about the importance of that scale and connectivity, and why it's important to some of the goals for the mountains to plains efforts. And maybe Meegan, we'll just start with you, and then Arvin, if you want to chime in, that we could do that.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I think one of the things we were lucky with in this area is that there aren't too many places on the Front Range of Colorado where you could make a connection from the grasslands, in this case on the east, to the montane systems on the west, just because our communities have generally fragmented that. I-25 fragments that. Some of our larger systems and urban developments fragment that opportunity. So in fact, the only other couple examples I can think of are down near Trinidad and south of Pueblo, where there might still be opportunity, or there's been work towards that, as well as the Greenland Ranch in the Larkspur area between Castle Rock and Colorado Springs. That's been achieved to some extent there. So it's been lucky that we were able to have the opportunity to do that, or the opportunity still existed at that time. And a big part of that, what we think about in doing that, is we as a single agency, and even with our partner agencies that do land conservation work in Larimer County, the City of Fort Collins, the Nature Conservancy, Colorado Open Lands, and some of the other land trusts, don't have enough money to acquire everything and manage everything into the future. So that again is where we really look to use tools like conservation easements and keep some of that land in private ownership, but make sure it's conserved and contributes to creating this connection across, in this case, about 5 ecotones, and that those conservation easements are well written, and those landowners are some of the best stewards that we have and know to help leverage our dollars and efforts in achieving that landscape scale goal.
Great. Arvin, do you have any additional thoughts on how that connectivity and landscape scale sort of affects the goals or outcomes for the bird populations and the diversity in that area?
Yeah, definitely. Scale is a really important issue for birds. Scale of habitat and connectivity. Of course, birds have the advantage of being able to fly between disconnected habitat patches. But the importance of scale, for example, for breeding populations, really cannot be understated. Birds don't just exist like in a vacuum. You can't just have one pair, of a chestnut collar longspur persisting in an area for a very long time. They require populations. Birds are social animals. Birds will attract birds, basically. So you need to have other birds breeding in an area for birds of that same species to persist in that area. So in order to support populations of these grassland birds, we need to have large expanses of contiguous grasslands. So scale and the degree to which that is true varies a bit between species. Some species can occupy smaller patches, but in general, larger patches of grasslands host more diverse communities of grassland birds. Connectivity on a landscape scale or even continental scale here. The soapstone and mountains to plains area is part of one of roughly 60 grassland priority conservation areas identified in the central grasslands region that the birds will use throughout their life cycle as they move north to south and south to north. So even though they're not connected physically, some of these grassland patches, these large areas, having the full complement of areas for grassland birds across their range from breeding to wintering areas is critically important.
It strikes me also, Meegan, as you were talking about that connectivity or all the lands that mountains to plains space occupies, that must have taken a lot of collaboration to bring all of that together, those different landowners. And I know you mentioned one or two of those partners, but I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about how collaboration has helped with the mountains to plain effort and how that was sustained over time. I mean, 30 years of, I think you said approximately, or however many decades this has been an effort. That's a long time to sustain that level of collaboration and outcomes. So maybe if you would just want to elaborate a little bit on how all of that came together and working across all those different agencies and bringing private landowners into that mix as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Arvin, if you don't mind. And yeah, thanks for bringing that question up, Jen, because I don't know that there's anything we do without collaborating in our department, because we just really rely on so many different partners, whether it's technical experts like the Bird Conservancy or the Natural Resource Conservation Service for helping identify grazing regimes and putting together our grazing plans. But from an acquisition standpoint, back in 2002, 2003, 2004, when we were first acquiring Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone Prairie in partnership with Fort Collins, it really required us to do a lot of outreach with a lot of the private landowners that work in this area and develop strong relationships, because we only work with willing landowners. And we at that time were able to apply for a large grant with Great Outdoors Colorado as well, which really was the key to us being able to afford to acquire those two key fee ownership pieces. And over time, we've received other grants to build off of that. So Arvin mentioned some of the properties we've bought in the last 10 or so years that have been in holdings that have been used towards match for some of the Bird Conservancy's grants. And those were largely successful because of all the years of getting to know those landowners, working with them, and having trust and relationship that they were willing to sell it to us. But we now that we've acquired a lot of the lands, and we're not finished yet with some of our goals as far as land conservation goes, but a lot of our focus is on management of these fee simple properties and cross boundary management with our conservation easement partners. And that looks a lot like working with people like Arvin to monitor and adjust, to plan around recreation. We have about 35 miles of trails between Red Mountain Open Space and Soapstone Prairie. And we developed our initial management plans and subsequent updates in partnership, because most of us have no idea who owns what property we might be hiking on, especially in this case, when you cross an imaginary line. And so having that consistent look and feel to the trail system, a lot of our cross-boundary weed control, because like birds, weeds don't live in a vacuum either. They move between the properties. And so really sharing our mapping, what we're seeing, the changes and adjustments we're making in all sorts of our management activities, and looking at that at a landscape scale as well has been key.
Arvin, do you have any thoughts that you want to add to that? You're muted.
Yeah, well, this whole project started as a collaboration. In fact, after the city first had acquired Soapstone, the initial survey work that we did to inventory all the birds there was funded through a Colorado Parks and Wildlife state wildlife grant. So that helped kick off sort of our collaboration with providing information to city and county managers on the birds there. And over the years, as we began to, again, collaborate with the city and county on using these investments as leverage for our federal grants from the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, which requires 3-to-1 matching funds. And for these migratory grassland birds, this was a perfect opportunity to use the large investments of cash to acquire or protect land as the match to fund the complementary work that needed to be done to research and monitor and protect populations on their wintering grounds, and to monitor populations within the mountains to plains area as managers began to take ownership and make decisions on these lands to see how the populations fared going forward. And we've been fortunate to have been able to continue that monitoring work pretty much every year since 2006. So we have a really long-term data set for some of the bird species. We haven't been able to monitor everywhere. We've focused primarily on prairie dog associated bird species, because those are some of the ones that we view as the most vulnerable. But it's all the work has been done through collaborations with both the city and county, the state, and as well as the federal agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, on the wintering grounds where we've been using most of the investment, in fact, I think I said it was about 3.4 million in grant funds that have gone to these projects in Mexico and on Soapstone and the Mountains to Plains area. All the work we do down there is in collaboration with partners, local NGOs and government agencies, as well, again, private landowners. And if it hasn't already been said, I mean, one point that's important to take home from all this is that grasslands are probably the least protected terrestrial ecosystem in the world. And so there are very few national parks, reserves, etc., that protect grasslands. So all the work we do to protect grassland species has to be done with private landowners. So the importance of collaborations is not lost on me.
Yeah, so that's a great point that you just touched on there, Arvin and Meegan. You mentioned it as well, is that collaborative work with private landowners. And actually there's a question or two from the audience about how the conservation easements work with the private landowners in that landscape, and how, I'm curious, like the audience member is curious about how restrictive they are, but I'd like to hear a little bit more also on, have the collaborative partners worked directly with the landowners on changing up their grazing management styles or other aspects of land management to improve the grassland habitat for different ecosystem services?
Yeah, those are great questions. I've been kind of watching the chat a little bit too, and I'm glad you brought those up. So a conservation easement it's a perpetual agreement between a qualified entity to hold the conservation easement. So Larimer County, the city of Fort Collins, for example, land trusts that work within the state of Colorado. and that private landowner. And so each conservation easement, while we have a template and often specific things we're looking for to conserve on that particular property, it is a negotiated outcome. So a particular landowner may want to retain the ability to allow hunting on their property. And that's something we readily allow in a conservation easement. The next landowner next door might choose, I never want to see hunting happen on this property. And that's okay with us too. So there's a lot of portions that we negotiate around. Grazing is a common one because of the landscape we work in Larimer County. There's a lot of large ranches and a lot of those are in active grazing. And it's a practice we like to see continued and done so sustainably. And so in our conservation easements, we do have language around sustainable grazing practices. And we rely on a third party if that's ever in question over time, because again, the conservation easement is perpetual. So if that landowner sells their land to a new person, the conservation easement goes with it. And there could be a day where we go out to monitor on our annual monitoring and we're thinking it looks a little bit overgrazed, or it's not, there's some practices that might not be as sustainable as we expect. And we rely on a third party in that situation. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, CSU has the expertise to come out and help broker that conversation about what needs to adjust or change to make sure those practices remain sustainable. We don't get closely involved in the management of those properties beyond ensuring the terms of the conservation easement are met, because there's a cost to doing that, and we just don't have that kind of capacity. But we do partner a lot with landowners to bring resources to them. So sometimes landowners, there might be an impediment financially to doing forest management, was a question someone asked. There are a lot of great federal and state programs to help support financially and from an expertise standpoint, doing good forest practices. So the Colorado State Forest Service office here in Fort Collins has one, and they do site visits and they have cost sharing and all sorts of programs that we often will link a landowner to them if we're seeing an issue on those conservation easement lands. Within our department is the Larimer County Weed District, and we have resources, expertise, cost shares, things like that to help landowners do good weed control practices.
Interesting. Yeah. Arvin, you've talked a lot about working with private landowners, and how does that look for you from the bird management perspective? I would imagine, they have to change some of their grazing or other land management practices. Does it work best with the bird-oriented landowners, or are they already willing because they've already been through the collaborative process?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. So it's a pretty different situation for me working in northern Mexico with landowners there. There are no conservation easements in Mexico. It's not available as a tool. So we have to come up with other kinds of solutions to implement conservation on private lands. Back around 2012, we started a program there called the Sustainable Grazing Network. And it's geared towards private landowners with the purpose of trying to create a network of protected grasslands that provide for the diverse habitat needs of grassland birds across their wintering ranges in northern Mexico. And the way we do that basically is to sign an agreement with the landowner that says, we'll agree to help you with your land management needs. First, we'll develop a shared management plan that identifies the needs from an ecological and management perspective, and then we'll help address those needs together. And so then we'll cost share on projects that allow landowners to implement new grazing techniques that allow them to better control the timing and location and duration of grazing across different parts of the ranch through the use of temporary cross fence and water access. Water is a big component to grazing. They need to be able to have water to move the cows around. So yeah, our collaboration with landowners is done on a voluntary basis, but through a shared agreement that we both sign on to. And then, we basically assist them in implementing this management plan that the goal of which is to create healthier grasslands, both for grassland birds. One of the big issues down there is overgrazing because it's a desert environment. Overgrazing can happen very easily. And so that is one of the needs that we specifically try to address, ensuring that more parts of the ranch are able to rest for longer periods of time. And that takes being able to use other parts of the ranch more effectively. So we work with landowners on a pretty different basis. I think we really do work with them on the management. Of course, they are the managers. They still control and do all the work in terms of where to put the cows when. But we together, develop a management plan that's based on the ecological capacity and needs of the property, and then help steward that plan with them over a period of 15 years. So we're about 10 years into the program now, and we have about 30 different landowner partners that we work with there on grassland management. It's basically an ongoing relationship.
Excellent. I'm curious, at the end of your presentation, Arvin, you touched a little bit on some of the monitoring data that Bird Conservancy has been able to collect at Soapstone and that in that area. And it strikes me that, one of the great things about the Mountains to Plain effort is the realized vision of adaptive management, of really integrating research and monitoring into the management decisions across that landscape, whether it's on the publicly held or indirectly on some of the private lands. I just wanted to hear maybe if you could touch a little bit more on some of what you both have seen as a result of the monitoring and how that has influenced management decisions, whether for the bison herd or other species of interest in birds on the site. And maybe, Arvin, let's just start with you and what you've seen from the birds and through the monitoring data.
Sure. Well, one of the big challenges that has affected not only birds, but other species as well, there has been prairie dog management. And, prairie dogs are susceptible to bubonic plague, or sylvatic plague, I guess it's properly called, which is carried by fleas and spread between other mammals to prairie dogs. But it can completely wipe out the prairie dog population in an area in just a year. And we didn't used to have this problem in our area. It's a fairly new phenomenon, these plague outbreaks. And so shortly after the city and county acquired Soapstone, a major plague outbreak occurred in the region that essentially wiped out the prairie dogs from one year to the next. And that was also followed by several years of very wet springs. So we had a lot of rainfall that transformed then these places that had recently lost all the grazers, the prairie dogs, into a tall grassland. And we almost immediately lost some of those prairie dog dependent species like the mountain plover. Other birds like the thick-billed longspur are a little less dependent on prairie dogs per se, but they were also negatively affected. So we've continued to monitor their populations, and the mountain plover population in particular has been on the verge of blinking out from the region since about 2008. And I know that the city and county have been working hard to find solutions to address the prairie dog question, because it's not just for the birds, but also for ferrets, for example, that need these large colonies in order to survive. So they've been taking on some additional management steps, again, in collaboration with the state of Colorado, CPW, and to develop basically an oral plague vaccine and have been testing this on Soapstone and Meadow Springs and some of the other ranches that host prairie dogs in the Mountains to Plains region. And it seems to be fairly effective in maintaining resistance to these plague outbreaks and maintaining the prairie dogs. But that's an example of one of the types of management actions that they've taken in response to seeing this dramatic decline in some of these important species. Another approach that was also has been taken and has had some success is conducting prescribed burns in some of these areas that had lost prairie dogs. And that was also successful in bringing back mountain plovers, although it has to be done regularly in order to keep those grasslands very short. And that can be a challenge in today's world with climate being what it is, and not wanting fires to get out of control. But that's a couple examples.
Great. Meegan, do you want to touch on anything, maybe how some of the research and monitoring influences how the conservation bison herd is adaptively managed?
Yeah, I'd love to share that example. And I should note that we do have cattle grazing on both Red Mountain open space and Soapstone Prairie natural area. And I was reminded to say so hearing Arvin talk about some of his work on grassland birds in Central and South America, because we, in effect, have created a bit of a grass bank with Red Mountain and Soapstone by allowing local producers competitive leases to graze on both those properties, and also allows them to rest their home place or move cattle in a different way and adjust their own management practices, maybe stay on the land longer and on their own private ranches too. And a number of years ago, when we started looking at the idea of introducing bison back to this landscape, we had the good fortune of connecting with CSU and the USDA. CSU is Colorado State University here in Fort Collins, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And they have a Foothills campus on the west side of Fort Collins, where they were doing a lot of work with bison to be able to remove brucellosis, which is a disease in bison that's endemic in Yellowstone. So it's been an issue with being able to move Yellowstone bison outside of Yellowstone National Park, because brucellosis is a really contagious, terrible, spreadable disease. And they came up with a methodology to remove the genetic material from those bison in Yellowstone, which still have very little introgression of cattle genetics, which is unusual in most bison not within Yellowstone National Park. And they can do an enzymatic wash and remove brucellosis from those embryos and implant embryos into other bison and produce a calf with those Yellowstone genetics. And the challenge that they had is they don't really have a lot of space out there at the Foothills campus. They have a pretty tight paddock they were keeping these bison in. So we established, in partnership with Fort Collins, Larimer County, and CSU and the USDA, this Laramie Foothills bison herd that you can see if you drive up County Road 15 on your way to Red Mountain and Soapstone. And when we originally established there's a 3,000 acre pasture that we've designated as our bison pasture, because we still see the benefit of having local producers and cattle grazing to meet other objectives on this landscape. So we identified a specific bison pasture, and with the Natural Resource Conservation Service looking at our grazing plans and capacity, we estimated about 100 bison or cow-calf pairs would be the right capacity for that pasture. And the bison have been on site since about 2015. And just this last year and a half or so, the herd has grown to just a little over 100 cow-calf pair. And so when all the work we do on our public lands, our open spaces and natural areas, we are constantly monitoring management actions or things that we're applying and doing. And the bison pasture is no exception. because we're really managing these bison as we would if they were cattle in the same pasture. It's a small area relative to, the late 1800s when bison, crossed the landscape and weren't fenced in. And we've determined over the last year or so, partly, we were in a drought year last year, and the bison have got to that capacity point that we were seeing some impacts to the range that exceeded the goals we have for how we want that pasture managed. So we're actually in the process of reducing the bison herd right now. And, it's something we see will ebb and flow over time. It may grow back in a few years to be able to be closer to that 100 cow-calf pair. Maybe it could exceed that in a certain year. But the last thing I'll say about the bison herd is the ultimate goal of this herd is that Red Mountain open space and soapstone are just a landing spot for them for a period of time. And the ultimate goal is to be able to send those animals off to other herds around the United States. And we've been really successful doing that over the last 5 to 7 years. In fact, about 40 bison were just sent to different tribal lands in Oklahoma and Nebraska just a couple weeks ago. So by reducing that herd, it doesn't mean we're eliminating those animals. They're pretty valuable animals given their genetics, but we're able to, once they've gotten all the close-in veterinary care, the genetics management here at CSU, it allows them to be able to be sent somewhere else and establish herds with those genetics elsewhere.
That's amazing. And I would encourage the audience, if you're ever having a rough day and you just need a pick-me-up, go look at the Facebook page for that bison herd, because the photos and the videos of the bison playing out in that beautiful landscape will definitely improve your mood for the day. We just have a few minutes left. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to get through all of the audience's questions. There's some great questions, but maybe just to close out, I'd love to hear from each of you, what keeps you motivated and inspired about working in that mountains to plain environment? And Arvin, maybe we can start with you.
Gosh, well, one thing that keeps me motivated through the Mountains and Plains project is that it really is like a crown jewel of the whole, natural protected area system we have, locally here in northern Colorado. It is an astounding property aesthetically, biologically, and it's such a unique model in that it still involves the local community. The local ranchers who used to graze on the Soapstone Grazing Association are still part of the equation here. So knowing that we can make an impact on the ground, and we've seen it through the bird populations in other areas. I didn't get to some of the more positive aspects of population change we've seen, but knowing that we can make a difference locally is what keeps me motivated to keep working towards bird conservation on a continental scale.
Yeah, I would echo that. It's seeing the real benefits and the conservation outcomes, whether it's the land or the practices. It's working with our grazing lessees and partners like Arvind and private landowners that inspires me. So I'm glad to be able to share with you all today, and look forward to the session number 4. I'm sure you're going to talk about, Jen.
Yeah, for sure. So everyone, thank you, Meegan and Arvin, so much for this conversation today. It was wonderful. I love all of your insights, and your expertise is amazing. And I just want to encourage the audience to participate in our 4th and final webinar in this series next week. We'll have a little bit more of a focus, bringing all of this, what we've heard over the first 3 together, and thinking about how that wraps into policy and solutions moving forward. It'll be an excellent conversation, and I definitely encourage you to participate. All of these recordings will be shared with you after the series is done and made available again. So please join us next week, and thank you for participating, and thank you, Meegan and Arvin, again.
Thanks for hosting us. This has been fun.